as you've just heard, this workshop is being videotaped. And so Jim Kodera will speak from here so that he is in line with the camera. And as we move to the question and answer period, you have been asked to speak from that mic so that you will be on camera too. So those are the only stipulations in terms of the workshop. Our presenter is the Reverend Dr. James Kodera. He was the first Asian American ordained in the Diocese of Massachusetts since its inception in 1784. Since his ordination in 1985, Jim has served in a number of parishes. He has been part-time rector of St. Luke's in Hudson, Massachusetts since the year 2000, where he transformed an all-white congregation into one with parishioners from around the world, including countries of Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Uganda, South Africa, India, China, Korea, the Philippines, Albania, England, and Norway. He has served the church at the regional, national, and international level, and most recently as president of the Episcopal Asia-American Ministries Council. Jim has served as professor of religion at Wellesley College since 1976, and for 3 years prior to that, he taught at Oberlin College. His current research focuses on the untouchables of India, with particular attention to their conversion to Buddhism and Christianity. He was trained in the historical and comparative study of religion, especially in Buddhism studies. He received his PhD from Columbia and theological training from Yale Divinity School. Jim was born in Japan and received his secondary school education there. His wife is a former missionary from the Philippines to the Anglican Church of Japan, where he founded a social agency. Where she founded a social agency on behalf of foreign sex workers working in Japan. Jim's maternal grandfather was one of the first Europeans to go to Nagasaki, Japan, after the opening of the country to the West in 1868. Many of his relatives perished on August 9th, 1945, when the second atomic bomb was dropped there by the United States. It is my privilege and pleasure to present to you the Reverend Dr. James Kodera.
I go by Jim, that's my preference. So we got a lot of time, right? Hour and a half. And certainly I'm not going to take up all the time. So let me say something for the primary purpose of being evocative, if not also to be provocative, in order to get as many of us involved in collective conversation, collective struggling, collective reminiscence, and most importantly, for finding cause for hope for the future, for the immediate future, not just for the distant future, which is easier to talk about than making plans for the immediate future. Are there any handouts left? I brought 43. That's my lucky number. So if we can put it close to the door, then you can. Yeah. Okay. Good. Great. Thank you very much. I decided to address 3 issues in the hope that you will join. not just by asking questions and offering comments, but disagreeing if that is your wish. So I always ask my students comments, questions, complaints, and I really do mean complaints if that is the case. The first one is, who is an Asian American? Who is an American in America? Excuse me, who is an Asian in America? Who is an Asian American? We have time to address this issue to a certain extent. Please remember the year 1952, when the U.S. Congress passed the McCarran-Walter Act. Officially, it's Walter McCarran Act, but I don't want people to think that Walter was the first name of Congressman McCarran. That's why I reversed it to McCarran-Walter Act, 1952, which made it possible for Asians already in the United States to become naturalized citizens with a quota slightly less than 3,000 per annum. Okay, 1952. So, as we said, some 120,000 Japanese in the 4 western states, fourth one is Alaska once again, they were interned. They were arrested without charge. They were convicted and incarcerated with no recourse to the due process of law. And they did not know how long they were going to be interned, but they were indeed told they were being protected by the United States government lest something terrible would happen to them. But upon arrival, they first went to temporary places, one of which was in Pomona, California. They were placed in horse stalls. And then a few months later, when 11 wartime relocation centers, that's the technical term, were finished, made of fresh green pine. They shrink, especially in dry places like Idaho and Wyoming and Manzanar, California. And they didn't know how long they would be there. So about 1/3 of these 120,000 internees were Japanese citizens. Effectively, many of those Japanese citizens were American bred because many of them came with their immigrant parents when they were very small, 1 year old, 2, 3 years old. They are the ones who had little memory of their presumed home country, but they were Japanese nationals precisely because they were ineligible for naturalization as U.S. citizens until 1952. The catalyst for their migration, not immigration, because unlike the Europeans who crossed the Atlantic, who could assume that they would soon become American citizens after they passed through Ellis Island, but Asians who came to Hawaii and then the West Coast afterwards, they were migrants, not immigrants. They were there for employment. Okay, so I think it's important for us to use the word migrants, not immigrants. Okay, and they started coming in the mid-19th century and well into the rest of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century. They came from impoverished areas of Asia. In the case of China, Guangdong, southern part. In the case of Koreans, they came a little bit later on. But in the case of the Japanese, they came from impoverished areas. Most especially, I need to add, Okinawa. Okinawans then, as today, are still discriminated against within Japan. Some people say Okinawans, or you can always tell them, just look at them. I can't. My eyesight is not that bad. You can tell Okinawans by their last names. And even today, if they want to go to big cities like Tokyo, there are only a few things that they can do. Entertainment, certain sports like boxing, baseball, never golf or tennis. And so that's how it was. Even among the migrants from Japan, Okinawans were discriminated against. You know who Eric Shinseki is? Eric Shinseki is now U.S. Secretary of Veterans Affairs. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when the Bush administration, the second one, was thinking of bombing Iraq. And Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld asked Eric Shinseki how much it will cost in terms of money and in terms of human lives. And he gave an honest answer. But according to Donald Rumsfeld, the estimate was way too high. So he was fired. And he is an Okinawan American who have been discriminated against in his native state of Hawaii. Okay? And he was one of the speakers when Daniel Inouye's memorial service was held at National Cathedral. And Eric Shinseki mentioned the discriminations against Asians in Hawaii. And he could have, but did not say. He was too gracious. Among the Japanese, well, Japanese never considered Okinawans to be Japanese. Okinawa was reverted back to Japan in 1972 from the United States. And one thing that was eloquent in his silence was the plight of the Okinawans in Hawaii. And Eric Shinseki is an Okinawan name, you can tell. Now, Asian Americans, 1952, we already talked about that. In the year 1970, that's the first year in which the federal government of the United States decided to create a new demographic group, Asian American and Asian and Pacific Islander American. It was a little bit less than 3% in 1970. Okay. Since then, Asian and Pacific Islander American have been separated. Asian American, one category, Pacific Islander is another category. But in 1970, part of the intention was to make that group as large as it could be. Okay, that was only 43 years ago. Since then, Asian American population has more than quadrupled. In the state of California today, largest Asian American population is Filipino, no longer Chinese. Fastest growth among Asian Americans in California is Southeast Asians. As I told you, Indian Americans are the wealthiest, and Hmong Americans are the poorest Americans, according to the last 2 U.S. censuses. So Asian American is a very large category indeed. But even more important is that Asian American is a demographic category that is extremely diverse within. What I'm trying to say is that they are not all the same. Okay? The catalysts in the bottom half of the front page of the handout. One is as part of the civil rights movement. The term Asian American was coined in 1968 by the students in the Bay Area, especially UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. They coined the term Asian American to refer to a group of people as well as a new field within the academic discipline. Asian American Studies was started at the University of California, Berkeley, just a year or two thereafter. One problem, in my estimate, is that since the late 1960s till today, as we speak, Asian American Studies is part of what the UC Berkeley calls Ethnic Studies Department. To put Asian Americans, or anybody for that matter, under ethnic studies is to marginalize them. So in 1994, when I dared to propose an introductory course called Asian American Experience, it was denied by the dean's office for 2 years. And they said, Jim, you can teach that just once. You've been after us for 2 years. And I offered it with more than 100 students there. Average class size at Wellesley College is 15. And the dean's office always look at numbers, right? Oh, Jim, please teach that again. And the dean's office suggested we put this under Asian studies. I said, no. I will teach it again if it's put under American studies. Because Asian Americans are here to stay. They're not temporary residents. They are not foreigners. They are as American as everybody else. Reluctantly, they relented. And it's been part of American studies. The most heavily enrolled course in American studies is the introductory course on Asian American studies. And 3 times, I'm doing this for the 3rd time, sequel to that course called Interning the Enemy Race in quotes, subtitled Japanese Americans in WW2. I try to make the title as short as possible, but it's still the longest one. And it enrolls, currently I have a student of African American background. I have students of Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean background. I have 3 or 4 students of Euro-American background. So it really has become part of the American studies curriculum at the college. Catalyst number 2, if you look at it, is the emergence of Asian countries in the world. This is in the 1970s, going into the 1980s. Japan was emerging as an economic and technological power. 3rd, this is somewhat controversial, but the students from UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. By the way, president of San Francisco State was Japanese American S.I. Hayakawa, who later became the first Asian American U.S. Senator. If you used to watch Johnny Carson, he used to occasionally make fun of S.I. Hayakawa, who was always falling asleep in the nation's capital. But at that time, the president of San Francisco State was S.I. Hayakawa. Governor of California was Ronald Reagan. And people used to say S.I. Hayakawa made Ronald Reagan look like a flaming liberal. And he was very conservative. Conservative enough that in order to deal with student uprisings on the campus of San Francisco State, he called in police. And a lot of people like that. Affinity with People's Republic of China and North Vietnam among the Chinese American students. They are the, shall we use the forbidden word, socialists. And they were deeply in line with the emergence of People's Republic of China and North Vietnam. This is, of course, before the fall of Saigon, April 30th, 1975. That fueled the creation of Asian American studies and Asian Americans as a demographic group in the Bay Area. 4th is a Pan-American, Pan-Asian identity. Only Americans have this Pan-Asian identity. In Asia, there is no such thing. Of course, in Asia, there are no Asian Americans. Asian American is only a North American phenomenon, US and Canada. 5th, this is a very important catalyst, so-called Vietnam War. You know how the Vietnamese call Vietnam War? American War. Same war. If you meet anybody who, Vietnamese Americans would not work, but somebody who came from Vietnam, how do you call a Vietnam War? They will tell you, we call it American War. But so-called Vietnam War, in which Asians, especially the Vietnamese Buddhist monks, exhibited courage in their non-violent protests against the civil war in Vietnam and against the U.S. involvement in the civil war in Vietnam. I decided to study Buddhism for the first time after I saw a photograph in the late 1960s when I was in college this photograph of an eminent Vietnamese Buddhist monk who immolated himself. And that photograph was the front page photograph on June 11th, 1963, exactly 50 years ago. And the article was written by David Halberstam, who wrote a book about the cabinet for JFK. What's the
best and the brightest.
The best and the brightest. Thank you very much. Yeah, David Halberstam. And that had a transformative impact on me. And I studied Buddhism for the first time when I was an undergraduate at Carleton College with a professor who had been trained as a Christian ethicist with H. Richard Niebuhr. And upon seeing that picture in 1963, he decided to retrain himself. And Bardwell Smith, whose father was one of the founders of Merrill Lynch, Fenner Pearson Smith, he's the one who inspired me to study Buddhism in 1967. So these are among the catalysts that empowered undergraduates in the Bay Area in 1968 and years following. That's when and where the term Asian American was given birth. Big rubric over here is Roman numeral 2, immigration laws and demographic change. Until 1952, this is what our primate mentioned yesterday, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was fully in effect. Let me say one or two things about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mentioned Leland Stanford, who built the Transcontinental Railroad, for which he used mostly Chinese coolie workers. Okay. Once the project was complete, Leland Stanford turned against countless Johnny Chinamen, and he had gotten himself elected as the new senator from California. Once he arrived in Washington, D.C., he befriended himself. He became very friendly with another new senator, James Blaine of Maine. If you go to the state capital of Maine, the governor's mansion is called Blaine Mansion. It's the same person. And they went around and did lobbying, as we say today, which directly contributed to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act signed in 1882. It passed with the smallest of margins. So both Stanford and Blaine said it's only for 10 years. But it stayed in effect from 1882 to 1952. So the passage of the Walter McCarran Act effectively put an end to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese Exclusion Act applied to the Chinese, but to other Asians as well. Where do the Indians fit in? That was debated then and still. Are they Asians or are they not Asians? Let me digress just for a moment. In the 1880s, the first major scholar of India in Europe, a German named Max Muller, wrote a small article in which he used the phrase Aryan race. In less than 2 years, he retracted that and said we should use the word Aryan only in reference to languages, Aryan languages, Greek, Latin, Persian, and Sanskrit. But high caste Indians, as Nell said, I've been studying about the untouchables of India. High caste Indians love that term. It was during the British colonial rule in India, and they were delighted. High caste Indians were delighted to be included among the Aryan race, together with the Germans and the Scandinavians and English. So they held on to that term, Aryan race, which is alive and well today in India, but not in Germany, where Max Müller was born. Max Müller was later summoned to Oxford University to become the first professor of Sanskrit. He never wanted to use Aryan in reference to people or race, only in reference to languages. But I think it's well for us to remember. So, Walter McCarran Act of 1952 had a very small restrictive quota. And that quota, national origin as it was called, was finally removed in 1964. The New Immigration Act, it doesn't have a sexy name attached to it, the New Immigration Act, signed by LBJ. And he said to Bill Moyers and others, he was only trying to fulfill the dream of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. Immigration Act of 1964, which removed once and for all national quota as a criterion for the immigration policies of the United States. Okay? Right now, we don't have to name names, but some elected officials are trying to restrict immigrations. So I sense an element of danger in the Immigration Act of 1964, which did away with racial quota. The reverse page, please. 1990 U.S. Census, Asian and Pacific Islander Americans comprise 2.9%. I think I told you earlier, just below 3%. That's 1990, 23 years ago. And in the 2000 U.S. Census, Asian Americans were expected to triple the 1990 figure. But before we get to that, this is, we refer to, consider. Under the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, efforts were made to prevent Asians from settling down in the United States. They were to be in the United States only for temporary labor. Okay? So only the able-bodied males were allowed to come through to the United States. In 1913 in California, Asians were given no right to own land. 1905, also in the same state, prohibition against Mongolians marrying whites. In those days, they used the word Mongolian to refer to Asians. Do Indians qualify as Mongolians? Indians said, no, we are Aryans, we are white. We are whites with darker skins. That's what they argued. Even before 1882, Criminal Proceedings Act of 1850 in California prohibited court testimonies from blacks, mulattoes, Indians, and Asians. You notice here, Indians and Asians, but in this case, Indians refer to Native Americans. 1853, George Hall was convicted of murdering a, quote, Chinaman, unquote. But the conviction was dropped because the only eyewitness was provided by another Chinaman. This is an example. Physical violence. This I didn't know until about 20 years ago. In 1885, massacre of 600 Chinese miners in Rock Spring, Wyoming. About 20 years ago, I had a student whose mother was a librarian in a public library in Hudson, Wyoming. And by accident, are you familiar with that place?
I'm a librarian.
Sorry?
I'm a librarian.
Oh, you're a librarian, okay. I go to libraries all the time. The mother of my student at Wellesley College, by accident, found documentations about the massacre of some 600 Chinese miners in that town. And she asked the school board why that was never included in the history lessons in Rock Spring, Wyoming. Next day, she was fired. But this student told me about that, so that together we might be able to do something in order to heal, reconcile, forgive, but not to forget. And forced relocation, this is at the very end, of some Asians, notably 120 Japanese, as they were called. They were not called Japanese Americans. 120 Japanese were arrested, convicted, and interned. They ended up on 11 wartime relocation centers. Only 2 states had two of these camps. California, Manzanar, which is right north of Death Valley. Roads are not paved there because the storms and all that, it's too dry. So only tumbleweeds and reptiles live in Death Valley, a place where the highest temperature has ever been recorded in the United States, as you know. Manzanar was created just north of that. I've been there a couple of times. First time I went there, there was only one other person over there who looked just like Pat Morita. Do you remember Pat Morita? Karate Kid? I said, gee, you look just like Pat Morita. And he said, I'm Pat. And he told me where his favorite places where he was there as a kid. So he said, I'm happy to tell you, this is where I learned how to swim, I learned how to fish, but I went to interview older people, especially St. Mary's Episcopal Church in the Mariposa area of Los Angeles, which was one of the second actually, after Christ Church in San Francisco, the second church built for the Japanese by a Canadian woman who had been a missionary to Japan, Louise, I'm sorry, I forgot her last name. And elderly people who were interned in Manzanar as adults, they just wouldn't say anything, just tears came down. Not that they didn't have anything to say, but it was just too painful, so only tears came down. But Pat Morita said, what would you like to know? I'm happy to tell you anything you'd like to know. And subsequently I discovered that during the internment period, from February 1942 until autumn of 1945, which month differed from camp to camp, Manzanar had the second largest population between Los Angeles and Reno, Nevada. Today, Manzanar, I know the exact population of Manzanar, 0. That's the only place that's been designated as a National Historic Site, thanks to Robert Matsui, a U.S. Congressman from California. So third and last, today, Asian Americans continue to live with the paradox of yellow peril and model minority. They find themselves caught between Asians as enemy aliens. They were actually reclassified as enemy aliens in 1942 by FDR, and model minority. They don't need any help. They're all doing great. Well, some of them are doing great. Many of them still are not doing great at all. So yellow peril is a term first coined in Southern California to express suspicion, hostility, and eventual isolation and expulsion in 1882. Yellow peril. They work too hard. They don't do anything else. They work too hard. Of course, they're doing great. Yellow peril. Unfair advantage they have. I don't know what those advantages are, but they said that. Neighborhood feuding with African Americans. That's a more recent thing. But let me call your attention to what the city of Seattle did. They still have a section in Seattle called International District. Maybe some of you know that place, International District. Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, and notice this, Portuguese. They were allowed to work anywhere in Seattle, but they had to live in that area designated as International District. Okay, that's what the city of Seattle did. They can work anywhere, but they have to live in the international district. One of the Japanese convocation meetings of the Episcopal Asian American Ministry about 5 or 6 years ago, we decided deliberately to stay in that hotel. I think there was a novel.
The hotel in the corner of Bitterness Sweet.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. We stayed there. And the interesting thing is that, this is part of the Japanese culture, traditional Japanese cultural heritage. They socialize not at the well, but in the public bath, when they're all, warm and steam coming out of their bodies, walls come down, and they share family stories. And that's exactly what they did. So in the basement of this hotel, they used to commiserate with one another. It was about to be demolished, but Norwegian American from Wisconsin decided to buy that place in order to preserve the history of anti-Asian and Asian American legacy from that time. And I want to share with you, I'm almost done here. I want to share with you a story involving a man named Frank Xinhua. When I was an undergraduate at Carleton College, I was a scholarship student, so I used to deliver books and mails. And that was very hard. It gets very, very cold. Without my glasses, I can't see much of anything. More than once, I thought I was going to freeze. And I got a cushier job later on, supervisor of the pool tables in that room, in the Willis Student Center, named after Frank Xinhua. And only in the last 5 or 6 years, I came to discover what kind of a student he was. He was from the International District of Seattle. He spent only 1 year at the college. He volunteered to fight in the European theater of the World War II. He was a member of the famous 442nd. Even today, they have one of the highest casualties, and they have the highest number of Purple Hearts given. Most decorated single military unit in the history of the United States military, even today. He volunteered, and he died in Italy. But his parents gave all kinds of money to the college. So President Gould decided that he should pay a visit to the parents of Frank Xinhua, assuming that the parents were very wealthy, given how much money they had given. When President Gould visited Seattle, he was escorted into this building in which the parents lived in a one-room apartment. They had given everything they had as a token of gratitude to 1 year of education at Carleton College. There's a book on that. It's a rather expensive book because of a lot of drawings and photographs, but Frank Xinhua. Now, model minority. As I said, the term was introduced in 1982 in Bill Peterson's article written for the New York Times Sunday magazine, in which he characterized Japanese Americans as model minority. Hardworking, especially, I misspelled this, it's sciences. No, that's not what I mean. In sciences, okay? Story of survival, story of assimilation, and story of thriving, okay? Now, in my opinion, the closest to model minority today are the Korean Americans, majority of whom started crossing the Pacific after the end of the Korean War, 1950s. And there are all kinds of parallels between the Korean Americans of the 20th century and the Jewish Americans of the late 19th century, especially from Eastern Europe. They excel in studying. They do well in their chosen vocations. Great importance placed upon family solidarity, both nuclear family and extended family. I have two friends. They are married to each other. They're 1.5 Korean Americans, Korean born, American bred. And one of them is the latest hire at Wellesley College as a Shakespeare scholar. And his wife, also Korean born, bred in South Carolina. Eugene Ko was raised in New York City in the Korean community. So after they both got tenure, you know what the tenure system is, right? They bought a house. And it was a rather dilapidated house, so they called in carpenters and others. And the first carpenter to come in asked Eugene Ko, "Wow, your English is so good." He's a Shakespeare scholar, you know, with graduate training at Cambridge, England, and Yale. "Wow, your English is so good. Where are you from?" I'm not going to look at the person because she's here, but last night I was having dinner by myself and I was talking to one of you, and she asked me, "Where are you from?" So I said, "Boston. I lived in Boston 2/3 of my life." And she said, "Where is your ancestor from?" And she asked that question with a total goodwill and naivete, may I say. But that's often asked of Asian Americans. My students say, you know, they went to a party in Boston or Cambridge during the weekend, and I was asked by almost everybody, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from San Francisco. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up." And often the next question is, "No, where are you really from?" Still at San Francisco. That's where this particular student was born. We don't ask those questions of Euro-Americans. And I want to tell you a comical, pathetic story. Byron, I know you know this person because he's a prominent member of the Massachusetts State House and Episcopalian. But during the November election, this person came, knocked on the door of our house, and he had somebody carrying a big placard with his last name, which is an Irish name. So when he saw me in the eye, first question he asked was, "Are you a citizen?" So I asked him, "Do you ask that question everywhere you go?" No answer. Second question, "Do you work at MIT?" Stereotype. Asians, scientists in Eastern Massachusetts, MIT. I said no to that. Third question, "Do you speak Chinese?" So I said, "No, I read Chinese, but I don't speak Chinese." So after a pregnant pause, I asked this person, I told you he had an Irish last name, "Do you speak Gaelic?" I asked that question. And he said, "Now I got you." And he went away. I told him, "I'll vote for you, don't worry, unless I find somebody more liberal than you are." And I said that in jest. And then I indeed voted for him. And about a year and a half later, I ran into him at a party to honor Mike Dukakis. And he spotted me right away and pulled me aside and said, "Gee, I forgot your name, but I really have to apologize for what I said." That was an isolated incident. But it is, may I use the word symptomatic, as if it were a disease, maybe addiction. And when it is done innocuously, with good intentions, I think that's fine. But sometimes it is not done with good intentions. And what are we to do? You know, I don't ask my colleagues, "Where are you from?" They say, "Such and such." No. "Where are you really from?" We don't ask those, but Asians and Asian Americans are often asked. In the late 19th century, the author of a famous book then, The Book of Tea, Okakura Kakuzo, who was a very good friend of Elizabeth Stewart Gardner of Boston. And he was in New York, and somebody said, "Are you Chinese, Korean, or Japanese?" And he had a very acerbic sense of humor, so he, in retort, he said, "Are you a monkey, donkey, or Yankee?" I don't say those things. I don't have that much guts. But I think he made a statement in the late 19th century. Okakura, Ernest Fenollosa, James Sturgis Bigelow, they bought most of what became the original collection of Asian art for the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Okakura was also a gay person, which is totally not said in Japan. He was the founder of the first art school in northern part of Tokyo. And he roomed at Isabel Stewart Gardner's house. Byron, you know, it's on Broadway Street, just about 2 blocks away from EDS. I'm done. My purpose was to be evocative and to be provocative in the hope that we can solicit some questions, comments, and objections. Whatever, anything will be accepted. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, I don't think this is on, your sense of the relationship between the Asian community and the African American community, both native to the U.S. and also within their native countries, because I've heard varying different opinions, and
Yes.
and I would like for you to speak to that, please.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
Yeah,
Let me say 2 things. One is the neighborhood feuding between Asians and African Americans involve mostly Korean Americans. In New York City, a lot of the fruit stands are Korean owned, and neighborhood African American children who want to work anywhere and everywhere, you know, they find jobs. They are not given jobs. And so that fueled all kinds of animosities, sometimes violence, between the 2 communities, New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. This is about 15 years ago. I officiated a wedding between 2 Korean Americans. One was a student at Wellesley, and she wanted to marry another Korean American from Philadelphia. They had both gone to Phillips Academy in Andover. That's where they met. And my student's father was a former South Korean ambassador to Thailand, where he was killed. There was a murder there by, so they say, by North Korea. And the man that she was going to marry is a son of a grocery store in Philadelphia. And during rehearsals and during dinners following the wedding, a lot of people, including myself, expected some class difference between ambassador's daughter and grocery store's keeper's son. But the people who are worried about that wedding were the groom side. They didn't know what they're going to do. One of their own married the daughter of a ambassador. Class difference over there. But they're both doing great in Washington, D.C., but amicable resolution is rather rare. I have another Korean American student who had grown up in Peru, and she was going to a church in New Jersey, all Korean church, Korean language church. And one day, one of the school children was shot by a neighborhood kid who was African American. And this student wrote a paper with a video attached to it. And that church decided not to retaliate. Instead, they decided to invite the neighborhood kids, mostly African American, for them to tutor these kids. And the paper was called "Who About This?" You know, it's where are you taking us? The other thing I wanted to say is that, as I try to say in the very limited time upstairs, we tend to think of racists in the third person plural. They are the racists. Very seldom we are the racists, especially I'm a racist. Very few of us say that. I have to acknowledge that there is a lot of racism on the part of Asians against others, but also against other Asians. And since I am of Japanese heritage, I am very anxious to say, every time there is an opportunity, that the wartime atrocities committed by the Japanese military since 1910 until August 1945 in the case of Korea. Korea was a colony of Japan from 1910 to 1945. Korean Peninsula was a reward for Japan after Japan's victory over Imperial China, Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and also a reward after Japan's victory over Russo-Japanese War, 1905. So there's a lot of racist sentiments among the Japanese today, not just then. And I think that there is something peculiar about people of island countries, Great Britain and Japan. Island countries, small, with historic inferiority complex toward people across the pond, the British toward the Germans and the French, Japanese toward the Koreans and Chinese. And the way to turn that around is through military prowess, colonialism. You know, British and Japanese share all kinds of things in common. They also love golf, but that's of course another reason. And so I'm always intent on pointing that out whenever I go to Japan. And as soon as I say that, they don't think I'm of Japanese heritage. They think I'm of Korean heritage. My last name, Kodera, sounds like Korea. So no, I don't have any Korean blood, but I'm speaking on behalf of the Koreans. So these are the two comments. A lot more needs to be said, but yeah. Yes.
Please be, I have to speak slowly because of my voice.
Okay.
I have two issues. One is I lived in Boston, worked at MIT, and was proud of the fact that Cambridge at that time was set to be one of the most diverse areas. I had a friend who came to MIT from Tokyo, and one of her, a statement that she made to me was concerning Japanese men, that she did not like Japanese men. And afterward, I worked with a student who said that she dropped out of school. This was in Pennsylvania now, because she said that, oh, why should I go through this to go home and serve tea? So the bottom line is gender issue. The second has to do with heritage. For African Americans, I'm trying to do family search. It is almost impossible for us to really go back and find our ancestry or where we actually came from. Many other people, in particular Europeans, are able to do that. They'll say, I'm 1/4 this or one half this, and so on and so forth. But African Americans are not able to do that.
Yeah, we draw fine distinctions when it comes to people like ourselves, whoever ourselves might be. But people who are over there, the other, we homogenize them as if they were all the same, even if they are not. So your comment, I think, is a poignant illustration of that homogenization of the other. And what's the opposite of homogenization? Heterogenization of ourselves? Yeah. Bill Russell, basketball player who played for the Boston Celtics, said that of all the places that he visited as a professional basketball player, Boston was the most racist place. But he loved the Celtics. He loved Red Auerbach, the coach. And since then, it's been said, Byron, if I'm wrong, please correct me. Boston is the most internally segregated place, Irish area, Italian area, Chinese area, Vietnamese area, more than any other city. Do you know, by the way, Byron, am I right? The largest number of undocumented aliens in the city of Boston, do you know where they come from?
Ireland.
Exactly. Not from China, not from Mexico. They're Irish. Why does it never become an issue? Race may play a part in it. I'm not sure, that's my guess. Yes, Irish are the largest undocumented aliens in Boston. Nobody's going after them. Dominicans in New York, California, the Chinese and the people from south of the border. That also makes us pause, I should think. But there is a very strong racist sentiments among Asians, not just toward non-Asians, but amongst themselves. Yeah. So I have a good opportunity because my wife is from the Philippines, and I can use that as witness to how important it is. Our common bond is the Episcopal Church. Yes.
What about the gender issue?
Sorry?
The gender issue.
Oh, gender issue. Yeah. Just so much to say. One of the best things that ever happened to me in my life was to be invited to teach at Wellesley College. Wellesley is the only school, not including Roman Catholic schools, that has never had a male president. Smith, Holyoke, they've had male presidents. And some male faculty complain that the males are marginalized by the females. But that is not my experience. I've been there for 38 years. That has never been the case. But in my department, originally Biblical History, Literature, and Interpretations department, which was required until 1966, now it's called Religion Department. I'm the first and last non-white person to be hired on the tenure track. We've had temporary, sabbatical replacements and all that. And that doesn't speak well. Yes.
Two observations. Your story about the massacre in Wyoming of miners is paralleled by a similar story of massacre of Irish miners in Pennsylvania.
Is that so?
Irish immigrants were discriminated against in this country. They blended in, so it's hard to discover ones without papers now. The other observation has to do with Okinawa, where you started.
Yeah.
Okinawa is still discriminated against by our government, which plants its military forces there in ways that are frankly racist. It's the only part of Japan that's been induced to carry that burden to such an extreme. And there is a continuing unwillingness both by the U.S. government to live up to what it has promised to do in terms of moving those troops and
Yes.
installations, and the Japanese government's unwillingness to encourage that.
Yes. The second point is everything you said is true. Governors, they have 44 prefectures. Governors often go through the polite motion of moving some of the U.S. soldiers to other places in Japan. So there's an Air Force base in Aomori. There's an Air Force base not too far away from Tokyo. But discussion comes to a screeching halt, doing nothing. A lot of the land in Okinawa is for use by the United States military. And even after 1972, when Okinawa was reverted back to Japan, people of Okinawa cannot go there. So it's if there's any disposable place or disposable people in Japan, that's Okinawa and the residents of Okinawa. During the feudal period from 1600 to 1868, people of Okinawa were enslaved by the people of the Shimazu clan, and they were not allowed to marry. And there's a famous children's story. You know, the Urashima Taro is a little boy who was once taking a walk by the beach, and a lot of naughty boys were hitting and throwing rocks at the sea turtle. So he fights against them and liberates the sea turtle. And sometime later, this sea turtle comes back when this boy was all by himself by the beach. He said, "I want to thank you for what you did. The princess or the queen where I live at the bottom of the sea wants to invite you." And he sits on the back of the sea turtle and goes, this is like a Rip Van Winkle story. He thought he was there only for a few days, but as it turned out, it was years. And when he left, I have to go home to see my parents. And this queen of the undersea palace says, "We want to present you with a gift. And we ask you never to open this box." Of course, it's like, you know, God speaking to Adam, you know, "You may eat of any tree in the Garden of Eden except for this one." That's where Adam went. So as soon as the sea turtle went back and he opened the box, white smoke came out, and suddenly he was an old man. And that story was born of that period in the history of Okinawa when they were enslaved and they were not allowed to marry. It's a fantasy. Yeah. And there was something else I was going to say. I forgot, what was your first point?
The miners.
Oh, the miners, yes. Well, once again, Byron, I'm glad you're still here. The Irish need not apply. In the history of Boston for a long time, Irish were not considered white. So in Pennsylvania too. By the way,
the Irish are a good example of invented race, right?
Yeah,
because the Irish were not considered. Well, you know, British still consider the Irish a race, right? And how they were going, you know, and the decision that they should be white in this country is a fascinating history.
that made it even more significant that John F. Kennedy was elected president from Boston.
Yes.
Yeah. Now Patrick Kennedy was not allowed to belong to all kinds of clubs. Yes.
Not an authority.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Oh,
They are still filming, and so it would help if you come to the mic.
You can come.
Yeah. It sounds like it's not working here, but it's working for them.
I'm not an authority, but there is a book entitled How the Irish Became White, and
Exactly.
it details that history very well.
Yeah. Yes.
I may be one of the few Mississippians around, and what he's talked about, Chinese Exclusion Act, it wasn't brought to my attention since when I was growing up. My parents said, "You're an American first, and then you're Chinese." It's not Asian American or Chinese American, it was American first. So I regret that sometimes because I didn't learn the language, the cooking. So, and that I missed because my father was a great cook. But I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, and we still had segregation in Mississippi. And I don't know if you know about this, but the Chinese were legally not allowed to go to the white schools. So sometimes the smaller towns especially would let the Chinese go. And my aunt was one of those who lived in a small town called Rosedale, Mississippi, in the Delta. And even though my mother was born in Mississippi, some of the whites objected to the Chinese going to the school. So my mother's parents sent her back to China to get educated. And unfortunately, they brought her back right after she finished just the 4th grade. So consequently, she always told me, you get your education first. Now, but I wanted to point out that Mississippi is quite different. And it's not as backward as a lot of people think. By the way, I had a friend who taught with me. I taught at the University of Southern Mississippi. And he went to school, he was black, went to school in Boston. And then he came to teach at Southern. And he often told me, I feel much safer in Mississippi than I do in Boston. Because of, I think what you were alluding to about the Irishmen, and they still have the conflicts there. But until I got married, we stayed within our own societies. We had our own, until mid 45, I think it was 1945, we had to have our own schools. We could not go to the white legally, or the black schools. So we had what we call Chinese schools, where a white teacher would come in and teach half the day, and then the Chinese teacher would come and teach the other half, because they wanted to keep the culture in there. Unfortunately, when I got old enough to go to school, we were allowed to go to white school, so I didn't get that experience. Just to show you how attitudes have changed. It depends on where you go. Now, I grew up in the Delta. Mississippi, you know about the culture that was in the Delta, the haves and have-nots. Okay? When I came to school at University of Southern Mississippi in Harrisburg, immediately there was a difference in attitudes and atmosphere. You were accepted for who you were. And I've had other faculty members from other parts of the country come, Filipino, et cetera, and they noticed that the same thing. So it's quite different. I never dated a Caucasian until I went to Southern. Because it was, at that time, again, this is during segregation, you stayed within your own class. I was fortunate in the sense that I was in music. I played in rock and roll band growing up with white guys. So I was accepted by everybody. They knew. I think I was the first Chinese to go to the country club in Greenville for social reasons. You should have seen the look on that woman's face when I walked in with an invitation. She was really shocked. But I fell in love with a Caucasian, no problem in Hattiesburg. Even though I think some of you know the law, I think it was still on the books in Mississippi that, what's it called, miscegenation laws. That you couldn't write into marry. We had no problem. And, but what I want to go back to was my father was one of those grocers who had the corner grocery store. And I didn't find out till later, after he retired, that he was not a citizen. It was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. After he retired, he went to Canada and then came back in and he became a citizen. So he did die a citizen. And that I'm very thankful for. Some of you don't know, but was it a year ago or 2 years ago, Congress finally apologized for the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, so it's still recent history. But I'm really here to say things are different in Mississippi. I don't care what anybody says. Racism exists everywhere. I can recall I used to judge drum and bugle boys, go around the country and judge them. And there was one, I went to Minnesota of all places, and the directors said they withdrew or pulled their drum corps from the town because some of the kids were black. Didn't think that the Midwest, especially Minnesota, would be racial, but they were. So thank goodness we're having this discussion, and that things, to me, are getting better.
Thank you very much for sharing your family history. Three things very quickly. I learned from Manel yesterday that one of her relatives married daughter or niece of Yuri Kochiyama. Yuri Kochiyama was a Japanese American from Mississippi who had been interned. Malcolm Little, who was an Episcopalian until he converted to Islam. Malcolm X died in her arms on the street of New York. Secondly, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the government of Canada did all kinds of things. Most of the Japanese were in the western part, British Columbia in particular. They were moved to inlands. And toward the end of the World War II, until August 1945, the largest Japanese-Canadian community was in Toronto. They were not allowed to go into the city of Toronto. They had to live outside. They had to hang around outside. Third and last, I told you that there's racism among Asians. Let me give you one specific example. Largest foreign population in Japan is Korean. And the Ministry of Education still has a law saying that foreign graduates of Japanese schools are ineligible for taking even the entrance exam to national universities in Japan. Why do they do that? By far the largest foreign population in Japan is Korean. So if they go to an American school anywhere, they can apply to Tokyo University and Kyoto University. But if they finish schools within Japan, or even foreign schools, like Korean schools, they are not eligible for entrance to national universities because the future leaders come out of only a handful of schools like Tokyo University, Kyoto University. They want to make sure that Korean Japanese or Japanese Koreans will not be among them. And that law is still in effect.
I'm from San Francisco, and we've been researching the history of the Diocese of California in relation to its ethnic minorities. I'm just wondering, and we here haven't found anything of direct discrimination, but a lot of silence in areas of the diocese not having a position or any recorded position of opposing things such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, the interning of Japanese Americans in the camps and so on, and especially given that the families that built the Southern Pacific Railroad across the continent and hired many Chinese to serve as laborers, silence about the dispersion of those laborers after. I would appreciate your thoughts if there's anything that perhaps the church should be speaking about, perhaps even apologizing for, and how that would play out in racial reconciliation. And the second part of that is racial reconciliation a zero-sum game? That one group, that it's not a full pie, but it's just a quarter of a pie, that different discriminated groups are fighting for their part of anti-racism. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Two examples of reparations. One is in the Diocese of New Westminster, in the Anglican Church of Canada. Only in the last 4 or 5 years, it was the information was divulged that Bishop of New Westminster sold 2 Anglican churches built for the Japanese fishermen. It took them more than 60 years. Apologies from the current bishop. Ingram, I think is his name, is it? Yeah. So it took time, but justice was done. The other example is the reparation of the Japanese Americans in 1979, I believe it was. In the final year of his presidency, Ronald Reagan, as President of the United States, signed a bill to apologize to those who are still alive among those who have been interned. A letter of apology and a check for $20,000. And first person to receive the letter and the check was a man named Yatsu, who lived in the International District of Seattle. He was the great-grandfather of a student of mine, Japanese American from Arizona. And I went to the annual meeting of the Japanese American Citizens League in Lowell, Massachusetts. And the speaker was Barney Frank, U.S. Congressman from Newton, Wellesley, that area. And what Barney Frank said was that as governor, Ronald Reagan had multiple opportunities to apologize. He said no. Until the final year of his presidency, and this is according to Barney Frank, he wanted to help his vice president, George H.W. Bush, win the California primary. He didn't, but he wanted to help him with the California primary. And by that time, a lot of the prominent citizens of the state of California were Japanese Americans. So Barney Frank said, whatever it takes, sometimes justice comes to fruition. I don't know whether we can count on, political calculations, but whatever it takes, I think we have to do everything. But since I'm primarily an educator, I would like to say, this came up in our panel today, in the long run, the most effective means of changing not only people's minds, but people's hearts is through education. And since my field is a historian of religion, and I would like to say with full confidence that there have to be multiple histories. We have to reject any notion of established history or official history, because every history is selective and purposive. They want to particular story, hence purposive. Selective because they have to pick and choose what data to use. And the example you cited in the Diocese of California is a good example. You have to, together, write new histories. Not just revisionist history. Revisionist history has a dirty name, It's the history of those who are complaining. But I think it should be multiple histories. So not Department of History, but Department of Histories. There should be women's history. Why is it that the secondary school level American history begins with Plymouth, 1620? Were they the first Europeans in North America? We all know that is not the case. There are Spanish-speaking people on the other end of the North American context. Why is it that American history does not begin with the Spaniards in Southern California, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona? Why does it begin with English-speaking people in 1620? How about the Dutch, who are along the Hudson River Valley, only a decade later? How come American history does not begin with the Dutch? Selective and purposive. And I think it is entirely possible. I think it's our obligation to have the courage to write alternative, sounds like a revisionist, but alternative histories, so that we can embrace multiple histories her story as well as history. That's a Wellesley College language. Women's Parliament, yes.
Once again, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I just wanted to lift up in the third section of the Asian American experience today. I wanted to include the voice and experience of interracial adoptees.
Yes.
And just how complicated and how complex that is when we have so many children that are adopted, especially girls who are adopted from birth, and they are raised as white Americans and do not have that connection to their own ethnic ancestry or cultural ancestry. I just recently came back from South Korea, and I spent some time with young women who have returned back to their homeland for the first time, who are really wrestling and grappling with this identity and this loss. And so it really just touched my heart as a woman of color, and I just wanted to lift that up as something that we can include into that.
Yeah. There was a time, I think there are still some people who are of Asian heritage, to overcome the historic discrimination against them is by marrying white men or women. After one or two generations, they're no longer Asian. But more recently, as they have come to empower themselves, mixed race, 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, they are beginning to identify themselves as Asians. And I think that's a very hopeful sign. Adoptees. When I first offered this course, Asian American Experience, in 1994, I had a student whose last name was Johnson. She was a full-blooded Korean, adopted from an orphanage in Korea. And she told me that the only other Asian she knew was when she stood in front of a mirror. She grew up in North Dakota. And she became an activist in the Asian American community since then. So once they face who they really are, rather than face who they wish they were, there's always a possibility for hope. And was that you who quoted Robert Frost? Yeah. He's not one of my favorite poets, but he said one thing, poetry begins with a lump in the throat. We are inspired to write new histories when we experience lump in the throat. When people fall in love, they have lump in the throat. But when they experience discrimination, or worse, even vicariously, there's a lump in the throat. And that's where we begin.